Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. So this is our chapter 7, Seminar in Public Management. So this topic we are going to talk about the accountability. I believe you have heard about accountability several times before. Remember when we talk about new public management, we try to implement whatever best practice by the private sector. So previously we are just talking about the responsibility, but then in new public management we try to imply the accountability in public sector. It means that the government officers or the civil servant need to be accountable on whatever their decisions, their action, and etc. So this is also one of the very biggest concern nowadays when we talk about when our citizen, our rakyat have more educated and more transparent in terms of whatever government has done, the policies, the action, the responses of the public issues, and etc. So we need to have to ensure that the accountability is actually in place. This slide is just to explain about the accountability in the private sector. So, as we know, the private sector has more and better autonomy compared in the government. In the same time, the wrongdoing of the private sector employees actually simply can be terminated by the organization. So in the same time, the accountability in devices in private, because they are responsible to the stakeholders, judgment of the rating agencies, the consumer, the clients, and etc. So that's the reason why they are more vulnerable in the sense of if we did something wrong in in whatever their decision and action. This slide is just to explain about the private sector's accountability, which is very ideal. So it's not quite easy to to imitate and to make sure that the accountability in public sector can be as good as in the private sector, because we have several challenges in government sector. But basically, we will look into the political accountability in the public sector. Accountability is fundamental to any society and democratic country. So it can be regarded as a principal agent theory, because between the government and the government itself and the government officials, because they are actually the agent who implementing the government policies, and because the citizen also have given their consent to someone else to govern on their behalf, meaning to say that the government officers or the civil servant is actually the responsible individual for the people. So all government action must be soundly based on law, because we have the pekeliling, we have the guidelines, and we have the policy. So we should refer to them. Yeah, and at the same time, some particular person is accountable for each of the actions of the government. For example, like the political, whatever decision made by these people. Accountability is not the same as responsibility. So because accountability means that someone in the organization can accept the blame or praise for a decision or action. From the lowest level of the public service to the highest, each member of staff is supposed to be accountable to a superior. Responsibility is something like more vague and usually regarded as operating in the other directions through the hierarchy. That is, everyone with subordinate staff is responsible for their subordinates' action. For example, like a cabinet minister is responsible for the action of the staff in his or her department, meaning to say in their ministry. Yeah, so this is more vague than accountability in that it is never quite clear exactly what they are responsible for or how far their responsibility extend. If a subordinate staff members makes a mistake, this does not necessarily mean that the supervisor is responsible for the mistake. So that's the reason why we need to have what we call the accountability. The accountability for finance, for example, the managers and the employees of any public organization have been entrusted with something quite valuable. So the taxpayers' money, the government money, the government budget, they have to be responsible and obligation to make sure that this fund or the government money has been used wisely. There will be no wastage or something like that. They ought to be held accountable for doing so. When they don't, they ought to be punished. Accountability for fairness is actually to treat all citizens absolutely fairly, includes protection from abuse of power. So there are rules and procedures to prevent this, and at the same time we also need to have accountability for performance, which is to make sure that their performance in work, their discipline, their integrity, and something like that. Accountability international model of administration was quite interested in this aspect, being obsessed by procedure and process, because we have the guidelines and accountability in the financial and legal senses rather than the achievement of the result. This slide explains about the various types of accountability. We have political accountability, bureaucratic accountability, and managerial accountability. So for the political accountability, in theory at least, all the actions of the bureaucracy can be traced through the system of accountability back to the voter, because the voter vote, the politician, the leaders. Okay, so you need to be responsible to the voters. In this, it is this system that prevents individuals bureaucrats exceeding their authority and behaving at all times according to the established rules. Although the two basic points of accountability are generally followed by the developed countries, there are significant differences in how they are approached by different political systems, most particularly between parliamentary and presidential system. So every act of every public servant or government officials is actually therefore an act of the ministers and the people who originally chose the minister through choosing the party that wins government. A civil servant is part of the executive branch, so they are accountable to their chief executive. So for example, like the president or the governor, or here in Malaysia to the prime minister. And as this person is chosen directly by election, political accountability is ensured by a line extending from the public servant to the voter, while bureaucratic accountability should also be through the hierarchical structure to the people, technically via the president. But this is not the end of the story. So the blurring of the branches means the bureaucracy is also dependent on the legislature and courts. The agency is responsible to the chief executive, as that office is part of the executive branch. However, the governing legislation and funding of the agency is under the control of the legislature, so there is also accountability to the legislature and to elected members of it. The courts, however, have an important role in the accountability system as well. Administrative acts of any kind may be scrutinized to ensure they can conform with the constitution, particularly those parts to do with human rights. Every citizen has the right to take court action against the government. Taking these points together means that the United States bureaucracy is supposedly accountable separately to the chief executive, the legislator, and the court. These separate accountabilities are likely to make the task of the management. So the bureaucratic accountability is the government officials or the civil servant who are responsible in their ministries or in the departments, government agencies level. So they have the responsible, to advise the political leadership in terms of the policy, in terms of the implementation, and etc. So they are also accountable in anything decision or whatever they are doing in terms of the implementing the government project, policies, initiative, and etc. Especially in terms of the financial performance and managerial. In a real sense of administration is not accountable to all, as its leaders can say they carried out the policy diligently. If something went wrong, it was the political leader's fault. A bureaucrat can hide behind anonymity and thereby avoid accountability. At this point, the bureaucratic, point number 2 here, rational part of the government suddenly confront the political part. Formal rationality versus political rationality in the forms of the ministers. While point number 3, the conventions of ministerial responsibility in Westminster system, even if rarely followed in act, was that ministers were ultimately responsible to Parliament for the action of their departments and had to resign for major departmental errors, whether or not they had prior knowledge of those actions. Avoiding embarrassing mistakes is not the same as providing any positive incentive to improve efficiency, whereas managerial model of political control is more realistic. This is perhaps more easily seen in the US, where agencies have always had informal and indirect links beyond the formal ones within the executive branch and have operated in quite different ways from the model set out earlier. In the formal model, agencies are firmly under the control of the president. In the real world, their funding and even future are dependent on the Congress, and their range of action is circumscribed by the courts. Accountability in this model cannot be of the rigid kind set off by an organizational chart. The relative openness of the bureaucracy and the easy access to information means that there is a different kind of accountability at work. For example, in the United Kingdom, where authority and responsibility are delegated as far as possible to middle and junior managers who are made aware of and accountable for meeting their cost and other performance targets. For a managerial view of accountability means that the government officials actually are responsible and accountable to the public because they have greater accountability for the result to politicians and the public, especially clients, which are the rakyat. There is a managerial accountability as well as political accountability, while the political leadership certainly has a major role in determining goals and objectives. So, for example, like strategic leadership, the bureaucracy itself is required to meet the target of the government and the policies. If public servants are responsible for the performance of their own objective, this may diminish the accountability of the whole political system to the extent that the public servant is to be managerially accountable. Does this not mean that the political leadership is less accountable? Perhaps politicians will no longer be responsible or accountable. However, in modern public administration, this is not just about efficiency. It is also about the ideas of democratic participation, accountability, and also empowerment. There is a corresponding tension between the conception of people as consumers and the conception of people as citizens. There are also a real problem with accountability in the private sector and obvious problems if this is to be emulated by the public sector, meaning to say that we cannot simply imitate that in the private sector, because in the real world of business, management often operates to its own benefits rather than its shareholders. Boards might be ineffective. However, the external presence of competitors to whom customers may turn if dissatisfied provides a powerful incentive to operate well, and there are continual and external performance monitoring devices available. Means introducing constantability for government services may have a similar effect. And last but not least, dealing with bureaucracy, then the citizen is once more in a complicated process competing against a huge apparatus with all the skills and all the force of the law behind it. Citizen victories are quite rare. As a conclusion, accountability is very important. Even in our country, Malaysia, we have the policy and guideline regarding on the accountability. So several programs and policies introduced by Malaysian government to improve the public accountability. For example, like we have the excellent service guideline in 1979, look is policy, punch card system, leadership by example, inculcation of the Islamic values, Islamic work ethics, client charter, and the recent one we have a GREAT grade. Yeah, so this is very important as well to be highlighted. So we have several mechanisms on how we can promote the accountability. For example, like Yang di-Pertuan Agong, we have the Parliament to monitor, and then under the Parliament we have the Public Accounts Committee who will always oversee on the accountability and responsibility of the government civil servants, and all the ministerial also responsible to implement this accountability in our country. So that's the reason why if you see many government ministries or the government bodies, they have what we call the integrity unit or something like that, because they want to make sure that it is implemented accordingly. And in the same time, even in our country, Malaysia, we don't have the ombudsman system. I think you can refer to my notes, but then we have what we call the Public Complaints Bureau. Yeah, so this Public Complaint Bureau, even though this is actually falls under or located under the Prime Minister office, and it should be actually independent body, but then still they are part of the government. So there are some critics regarding on this, because to what extent they are actually transparent, to what extent they are actually non-biased. So we hope that with this new public management we can improve better in terms of the performance of our civil servants.